The signal had been traveling through empty space for 11 days before anyone picked it up. It was a simple distress call, the kind that every spacefaring species in the Galactic Cooperative knew how to send. Short bursts of coded sound, repeating over and over, like a person knocking on a door and hoping someone on the other side was still awake. The signal came from the Karath Expanse, a dying star system far out on the edge of cooperative space, where the stars were old and the planets were cold and very few people bothered to go. The ones who sent the signal were called the Velhari. They were a quiet species, tall, thin, with skin so pale it was nearly see-through, and wide eyes that caught light the way still water does. They breathed a mixture of gases that most other species found unpleasant, and they spoke in soft, layered sounds that their translators struggled to carry properly. They had joined the Galactic Cooperative 300 years ago and had spent most of that time being polite, staying out of arguments, and trading their mineral resources for protection they hoped they would never need. They needed it now. Their colony ship, the Saratha's Promise, had been moving through the Karath Expanse on a routine resupply run when the Draknari found them. The Draknari were not part of the Cooperative. They did not want to be. They were large, hard-shelled, and operated under a simple philosophy. If you were weaker than them, you belonged to them. They had been raiding outer systems for decades, taking ships, taking cargo, taking people. The Cooperative had filed formal complaints. The Draknari had ignored every single one. That the Saratha's Promise was carrying 412 Velhari civilians, families, workers, 36 children who had never seen anything outside of a colony ship. The Draknari surrounded them in less than an hour, cut their engines with an electromagnetic pulse, and sent a single message. "Give us everything or we start cutting holes in your hull." The Velhari sent their SOS and waited. They waited for the Cooperative's peacekeeping fleet, a measured, careful collection of ships that operated on committee decisions and formal resolutions. They had heard it could take weeks for the fleet to mobilize. Weeks was too long. The Draknari were not patient. What they did not know, what almost no one outside of Earth had fully understood yet, was that humanity monitored cooperative distress frequencies around the clock. Every single day, without exception, not because they were required to, because they wanted to. Captain Dale Mercer was sitting in the command chair of the UES Ironclad when the signal came through. He was a big man, somewhere in his mid-40s, with short brown hair going gray at the sides and the kind of face that looked like it had been outside in bad weather many times and had not minded. He was from a small town in Montana where the winters were brutal, and people were expected to look out for their neighbors without being asked. He had carried that idea with him into space. He listened to the distress call once. The translator gave him the basics: civilian ship, hostile force, immediate threat to lives. He set down his coffee mug, which had a small chip on the handle that he had never bothered to fix, and turned to his helmsman. "Let's plot a course to the Karath Expanse," he said. "All ahead full." His crew moved without hesitation. That was one thing about the Ironclad. The people on it had served together long enough that they did not need long explanations. Lieutenant Kara Novak, the communications officer, had already opened a channel to Earth Command before Mercer finished his sentence. She was young, sharp, and had a habit of finishing reports 3 hours before they were due. She fired off the relay in clean, precise language and leaned back to wait. The response came in 4 hours. Not just authorization to proceed. Earth Command was sending more ships. Novak read the dispatch twice, then turned her chair to face Mercer. "Sir," she said, "they're sending 17 vessels. The Granite Wall, the Pale Horse, the Cedar Ridge, the Broken Sky." She kept reading the names down the list. Heavy destroyers, rapid frigates, 2 troop carriers, a mobile repair station. Mercer nodded slowly. "How long until the nearest ones can match our heading?" 6 hours, sir. The Granite Wall is already moving." He nodded again and picked up his coffee. It had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. On the Cooperative's listening station near the Karath border, an elder Velhari diplomat named Sarath Vo was watching the human fleet mobilize on a tactical display. He had lived for 240 years. He had seen wars, famines, the collapse of 2 star systems, and the slow death of a sun. He was not easily shaken. He was shaken now. The human ships were not elegant. They were not the slim, de-tapered vessels that most cooperative species preferred, built for speed and the appearance of peaceful intent. Human ships were dense and wide, with thick layered plating that made them look like they had been built to hit things and keep going. They moved fast for their size in a way that felt slightly wrong, like watching something too heavy run at full speed. 17 of them, forming up in deep space, turning toward the Karath expanse. Sarath Vo opened a channel to the Cooperative Council. His voice was steady, but only just. "I have been watching the human response since the signal was received," he said. "I want the Council to understand something. They did not hold a vote. They did not form a committee. One of their captains heard the distress call and moved his ship. Their command sent 17 more within hours, not days. Hours." A council member from the Athari delegation, a careful, slow-speaking species who handled most cooperative policy decisions, replied thoughtfully, "Is there a concern, Elder Sarath Vo?" The old Velhari looked at the display. 17 ships, moving at full speed toward a hostile fleet. No hesitation, no formal resolution, no extended debate. "Not a concern," he said quietly. "More of a realization. I do not think we understood what we were asking when we invited humanity into the cooperative. I do not think any of us fully understood what they are." The council member asked what he meant. Sarath Vo watched the human formation grow tighter on the display, the ships adjusting their heading in smooth coordination like a fist slowly closing. "I mean," he said, "that they did not ask whether the people on that ship were worth saving. They did not calculate the risk first. They heard that someone was in danger and they moved. All of them. Immediately." He paused. "I have never seen another species do that. Not once. In 240 years. The channel was quiet for a moment. Aboard the Ironclad, Captain Mercer was reading the latest sensor report on the Draknari fleet. 12 warships, standard configuration. He had faced worse odds in a training simulation during his 2nd year at the Academy. He was not worried about the numbers. He was thinking about the 412 people on the Velhari ship and how cold and quiet it must feel to be sitting in a damaged vessel in the dark, wondering if anyone was coming. He looked over at Novak. "Say, send a message to the Saratha's promise on the emergency band. Let them know we're on our way. Give them our ETA." She sent it. Somewhere in the dark of the Karath expanse on a cold and quiet ship surrounded by enemies, a Velhari mother holding her child felt the ship's communication system crackle. She heard the message, a human voice calm and plain, giving a time and a heading. She did not understand the language, but she understood the tone. Someone was coming. Someone was already on their way. War Commander Urath Kel had never lost a battle. He had been leading Draknari fleets for 30 years, and in those 30 years he had taken 14 systems, crushed 6 governments, and forced more species than he could easily count into labor contracts they could not refuse. He was not the largest Draknari to ever hold command, but he was the most patient, and patience in war was worth more than size. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Vrath Dominion, and looked at the Velhari colony ship drifting in the center of his formation. It was a soft, rounded vessel, built for comfort, not conflict. Its engines were dead. Its weapons, such as they were, had been disabled in the first pass. The Velhari inside were sending their distress signal on repeat, which was fine. Let them call. The nearest cooperative fleet was days away, and by then, Urath-Kel would be gone, cargo and passengers in tow. He had received the intelligence file on humanity 6 months ago when Earth joined the cooperative. He had read it once, set it aside, and not thought about it again. Bipedal, carbon-based, fragile internal structure, no natural armor, no venom, no enhanced senses. Moderately short lives. Their one interesting trait was that they came from a planet with high gravity, high radiation, and a food chain that had apparently tried to kill them at every step. But so what? Difficult origins did not always produce dangerous adults. Urath-Kel had conquered species from far harsher worlds. He was reviewing the cargo manifest of the Saratha's Promise when his sensors officer went quiet. The silence was unusual. His sensors officer was not a quiet individual. "Report," Urath-Kel said, without looking up. "Commander." The officer's voice was careful in a way that made Urath-Kel set down the manifest. "I am reading multiple vessels dropping out of faster-than-light travel, at the edge of the system." "Cooperative peacekeepers?" "No, Commander. The mass signatures are—" The officer paused. "They are wrong. Too dense, too heavy for standard cooperative vessels." Urath-Kel turned. "Identify." There was a short silence while the system ran its comparisons. Then the officer looked up from his station, and his expression was one Urath-Kel had never seen on him before. "Human vessels, Commander. 17 of them." The bridge was very quiet. Urath-Kel looked at the display. 17 contact points had appeared at the edge of the system, spread in a wide arc, already moving inward. He pulled up the visual feed. The ships were not what he expected. He had seen images of human vessels in the intelligence files, but looking at them on screen was different. They were wide and solid and blunt, with none of the geometric elegance that defined Draknari or cooperative ship design. They looked industrial, purposeful, and like they had been built by people who were not interested in how the ship looked, only in what it could take. He opened the old intelligence file on his personal screen. He read faster this time. Human crew sizes were enormous. They staffed their ships 2 to 3 times over what most species considered standard. Their armor plating was 3 times the thickness of comparable Draknari vessels, which explained the mass readings. Their medical technology was unusually advanced, focused almost entirely on keeping damaged crew members functional and returning them to duty. Their pain tolerance, according to multiple observed accounts, was remarkably high. One line caught his attention. It had been written by an analyst who had apparently spent a year observing humanity directly, embedded in a neutral station near Earth space. And the line read, "They do not treat acceptable casualties the way other species do. Most species calculate how many losses are tolerable before withdrawal. Humans appear to calculate how many losses are tolerable before the action becomes personal. These are very different numbers." Urath-Kel read that line twice. His communications officer spoke up. "Commander, the lead human vessel is hailing us." "Put it through." The voice that came over the bridge speakers was flat and unhurried, not aggressive, not theatrical, just a man stating facts. "Draknari Fleet. This is Captain Dale Mercer of the United Earth ship Ironclad. You are currently holding a civilian vessel and its crew under illegal threat of force. I am asking you once politely to stand down and withdraw. I won't be asking twice." That was it. No speech, no list of demands. No formal declaration in the name of the cooperative. Just one sentence that functioned very quietly as a warning. Urath-Kel studied the human formation. They had spread into a combat arc, wide, covering multiple approach vectors, cutting off his most efficient withdrawal routes without appearing to do so directly. It was a good formation. He would not have expected it from a species so new to cooperative space. He looked at his fleet. 12 ships, battle-tested, well-armed. His crew had fought together for years. He looked at the human formation. 17 ships, dense, moving steadily closer without any apparent hurry, as though they already knew how this ended. He pulled up the footnote at the bottom of the intelligence file, the final note the analyst had added, apparently after everything else had been written. It read simply, "Do not engage. Do not provoke. Do not assume that their offer of negotiation is a sign of weakness. It is not. They offer it because their culture values the chance to avoid unnecessary harm. If they are forced past that point, they will not stop." Urath Kel closed the file. His first officer, Kreth Var, stepped up beside him and spoke quietly. "Commander, the odds are not unfavorable. 12 ships against 17, but our crews are more experienced. We have fought in this system before. We know the debris fields." "Yes," Urath Kel said, "the humans are far from home. Their supply lines are long. They cannot sustain a prolonged engagement in deep space as easily as we can." "Yes," Urath Kel said again, "and there is the matter of pride, Commander. If word spreads that we withdrew from a cooperative response force—" "I heard the captain," Urath Kel said. "He said he was asking once." Krethvar fell silent. Urath Kel thought about the 14 systems he had taken. He thought about the flag of the Draknari Empire that flew over 6 enslaved worlds. He thought about 30 years of never losing. He thought about the analyst's note. They will not stop. He looked at the display one more time. The human ships had closed the distance by another 30,000 kilometers while he was thinking. They had not accelerated. They had not made any aggressive move. They were just moving forward at the same steady pace, like something that had decided on a direction and was not going to change it. "They are bluffing," he said. He did not believe it, but he said it anyway, because the alternative was admitting, in front of his entire bridge crew, that he was afraid of 17 ships from a species that had only been in space for a few hundred years. "Battle formation," he ordered. "All weapons online." Krethvar moved to carry out the order, but as he walked to his station, he glanced one more time at the human ships on the display, 17 dense, heavy, ugly vessels moving forward without hesitation, and for the first time in his career, he found himself hoping his commander was right. Aboard the Ironclad, Captain Mercer watched the Draknari ships shift into their attack formation. He had expected this. He set his coffee mug in its holder, the magnetic one, designed for combat maneuvers, and looked at his tactical officer. "Nate," he said, "they're not standing down." Commander Nate Calloway, and a broad-shouldered man from East Texas who had grown up hunting in dense woods and had the patience of someone who understood that waiting was part of the work, looked up from his station. "No, sir," he said. "They are not." Mercer nodded. "Then let's go get those people." The battle lasted 22 minutes. That was not unusual by human standards. Most real engagements in space were short, brutal things, nothing like the long, drawn-out fleet battles that showed up in historical dramas. Ships moved fast, weapons hit hard, and decisions had to be made in seconds. What was unusual about the Battle of the Karath Expanse was not how long it lasted. It was how it went. When the Draknari opened fire, they did what they always did. They targeted engines first, disable the enemy, then dictate the terms. It was a clean, an effective tactic that had worked for them in every battle they had ever fought. The Draknari plasma cannons were powerful, accurate, and designed to burn through standard cooperative hull plating in 2 or 3 direct hits. The first volley hit the Ironclad 6 times. The Ironclad kept moving. On the Draknari flagship, the weapons officer stared at his readout and then looked at his commander. "Direct hits confirmed, sir. 6 impacts on the lead human vessel. I am reading—" He paused and checked the readout again, because the first reading did not seem possible. "I am reading minimal hull breach. Their plating absorbed the majority of the impact." Urath Kel said nothing. The Ironclad did not return fire right away. Instead, it pushed forward, closing the gap between itself and the nearest Draknari destroyer. This was not standard. Standard combat doctrine said you maintained distance, used your range, let your weapons do the work. Closing range was what you did when your weapons were not enough. It was a sign of desperation. Commander Nate Calloway was not desperate. He had grown up hunting wild boar in the thick brush of East Texas, following animals through heavy undergrowth where the trees were close together and you could not always see more than 20 feet in front of you. He had learned early that in tight spaces, size and speed were less important than knowing exactly where you were going. He watched the Draknari formation the way he used to watch brush for movement, patient, still, waiting for the pattern. The Draknari ships were fast, and they used that speed to keep distance and fire from range. But their speed required room. In close quarters, when it became a problem, they could not turn as sharply, could not use their full engine power without risking collision, and their weapons were calibrated for long-range firing arcs, not short ones. Calloway gave his firing orders with the same quiet steadiness he used for everything. Target the Draknari corvette at bearing 270. Engine array. Don't destroy it, disable it. The Ironclad's railgun battery fired twice. The Draknari corvette's engines went dark. It drifted. Next target, Calloway said. Across the human formation, the same pattern was playing out. The human ships were not trying to destroy the Draknari fleet. They were taking it apart piece by piece, with the careful precision of people who had thought about this kind of work and decided that breaking something was more useful than destroying it. Undisabled ships could be boarded, searched, their crews taken into custody. Destroyed ships taught less of a lesson. Ensign Laura Finch was 23 years old. She had grown up in a small city in Ohio and had joined the fleet because she was good at spatial mathematics and bad at sitting still. She had never been in a real battle before the Karath Expanse. She had run simulations, hundreds of them, but simulations did not carry the weight of real consequences. She was manning the Ironclad's point defense station when one of the Draknari light fighters broke through the outer screen. It was fast, faster than anything in the simulations, and it was heading directly for the Ironclad's port-side communication array. If it hit, the Ironclad would lose contact with the rest of the fleet. Finch had 3 seconds, and she pulled power from the secondary engine bank, something she was technically not authorized to do without clearance from engineering, and rerouted it to the forward railgun array. She fired 3 shots in 4 seconds. The first missed. The second clipped the fighter's wing. The third hit the engine housing. The fighter broke apart in a clean burst of light and metal. Finch took one breath, put the power allocation back to where it belonged, and went back to her board. Later, when someone in the engineering deck noticed the unauthorized power reroute in the system log and asked about it, she said simply, "It needed to be done." And that was the end of the conversation. On the Draknari flagship, Urath Kell watched his fleet collapse in pieces. Not all at once. The humans were not overwhelming them with sheer firepower, and they were dismantling them. One ship disabled here. One ship's weapons taken offline there. 2 of his destroyers were drifting. His fastest corvette had lost its engine array. His fighter wing had taken heavy losses trying to find gaps in the human point defense, and those gaps did not seem to exist. He had 12 ships. 3 were now combat ineffective. 2 more were pulling back to deal with internal damage. His formation had been broken apart by the human tactic of driving into close range and forcing them to fight in tight spaces where their speed advantage disappeared. He opened a channel. "Human vessel. I told you I wasn't asking twice," said the flat, unhurried voice of Captain Mercer. Urath Kell closed the channel. A moment later, the Ironclad's bow cannon fired once. It was a precisely placed shot. Not at the flagship's hull, not at the crew compartments, not at anything that would cause catastrophic damage. It hit the engine array and the forward weapon systems in a grouped strike that the Draknari engineers would later describe, with reluctant admiration, as almost surgical. The Vrath Dominion went dark, No engines, no forward weapons, no communication array. It drifted in silence. The battle was over. Urath Kel sat in his darkened bridge and listened to the ship's emergency lighting hum on. His first officer, Kreth Var, stood beside him in the dim red glow, looking at the display. Every ship in their fleet was either disabled or holding position with weapons powered down, waiting to see what happened next. None of them had been destroyed. "They left us alive," Kreth Var said. It came out sounding confused, as if he were reporting a sensor malfunction. "Yes," Urath Kel said. "Why?" Urath Kel thought about the analyst's note. "They offer it because their culture values the chance to avoid unnecessary harm." He thought about the captain's voice, flat and unhurried, not angry, not triumphant. Just a man carrying out a decision he had already made before the battle started. "Because they wanted us to think about it," he said. Kreth Var looked at him. "Think about what?" "What we did. What they did. What the difference is." Urath Kel looked at the dark display. "If they had destroyed us, there would be nothing to think about. Dead soldiers do not change their minds." The bridge was quiet for a long moment. Then Urath Kel said very quietly, and something he had never said in 30 years of command, "We made a mistake. Not a tactical mistake. Not a mistake about formations or weapons loadout or approach angles. A deeper mistake. The kind that started before the first shot was fired in the moment he looked at the intelligence file and decided he already knew what he was dealing with. He had underestimated them. Not their ships, not their weapons, not their numbers. He had underestimated the thing that drove them to cross deep space in 6 hours, because a species they had only known for a year sent a distress signal. He had underestimated what it meant that they came at all, and that even after the shooting started, they only took what was necessary and left the rest intact. A human voice came over the emergency channel, calm, unhurried. The same voice as before. "My Draknari fleet. This is Captain Mercer. Your vessels are disabled. Your crew is alive. A boarding team will approach the flagship in 10 minutes to take custody of command staff. Civilian personnel on the Velhari vessel are to be released immediately. Comply. And your crews will be treated according to cooperative law. That's it." Urath Kel pressed the response key. "Understood," he said. It was the first time in 30 years he had ever said that word to an enemy. The Velhari had a word for the feeling of being saved when you had stopped believing help was coming. It did not translate well into any other language. The closest meaning in standard cooperative speech was something like the warmth of an unexpected hand. Velhari children were taught it early, and because Velhari history was full of moments when they had needed saving, and the saving had come too late, or not at all. They carried the word the way some species carried old scars, as a reminder of how things could go, and sometimes did. When the human fleet arrived at the Karath Expanse and the Draknari went silent, Elder Sarath Vo stood in the observation room of the cooperative listening station and said that word out loud, alone, to no one in particular. His pale membranes shifted through 3 different colors before settling on the faint, trembling blue of profound relief. The Velhari on the Saratha's promise were shaken, but alive. They had spent 11 days in a cold ship, rationing their reserves, keeping the children calm with stories and songs, and watching the Draknari hold position outside their hull. When the human fleet arrived and the enemy ships began going dark one by one, several of the Velhari adults had to be helped to sit down because their legs stopped working correctly. It was a biological response, a full-body release of tension that they had been holding for 11 days. Their medical staff treated it like the aftershock it was. The rescue teams that came from the human ships were not what the Velhari expected. They had been told that humans were large. That was true. The first team to board the Saratha's Promise included 6 crew members in full environmental gear, and even in their suits, they were visibly broader and heavier than most cooperative species. Their movements were efficient. Not aggressive, but very deliberate, the way large animals move when they are trying not to startle anything smaller. One of them, a young woman named Ensign Finch, had been assigned to the boarding team at the last minute because she spoke the most basic level of cooperative standard, and because Commander Calloway had said simply, "She has a good face for first impressions." Her crewmates had accepted this as a reasonable reason, because it was true. She was the first one through the inner airlock door, and the first thing she saw was a Velhari child. Very small, wrapped in a thermal blanket, with enormous pale eyes staring up at her from behind a support strut, where the child had apparently been sitting for some time. Finch stopped. She crouched down, which brought her closer to the child's eye level. She held up one hand, palm out, a gesture that her basic training had listed under non-threatening signals cross-species. Then she smiled. Now the child stared at her for a long moment, then reached out and touched the glove of her suit with 2 careful fingers. The Velhari medic nearby made a sound that the translator rendered as "oh" in the smallest possible voice. The formal visit happened 2 days later. Elder Sarathvo came aboard the Ironclad in a sealed environmental suit with 2 staff members and a translator unit strapped to the forearm of his suit. He had visited cooperative vessels before, but nothing quite like this. The Ironclad's corridors were wide enough for 2 humans to walk side by side without touching, and the ceilings were high, and everything was solid and slightly too heavy and built with the philosophy that things should keep working even after something bad happened to them. The gravity was a fraction higher than cooperative standard. Nothing severe, but Sarath Vo noticed it in his knees. Finch was his escort again. She walked beside him at a considerate pace, slower than her natural stride, and answered his questions as they went. He asked about the paintings he noticed near the mess hall. 3 of them framed and hung on the wall. One was a mountain range. One was a coastline at what he assumed was sunset, given the colors. One was a very simple painting of a dog sleeping on a porch. He asked why they were there. Finch thought about it for a moment. "People put them up because it helps," she said. "Being far from home for a long time is hard. Having something that looks like home makes it a little easier." He processed this. "Your species finds extended separation from your home world difficult?" "Pretty much every species does, I think," Finch said. But you go anyway." "Yeah. Why?" Finch paused at a corridor junction and pointed him toward the left passage. "Different reasons for different people, I think. Some of us do it because we're curious, some because there's nothing keeping us home, some because we feel like there's work out here that needs doing and someone should be doing it." She paused. "Some of us just can't sit still." He asked her how she had felt during the battle. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. He had expected a deflection. Humans, from what he had read, were sometimes reluctant to discuss emotional states directly. Instead, she said, "Scared. Pretty scared, honestly, at a couple of points." "But you stayed at your station." "Of course," she said, as if this were obvious. "You were afraid, but you kept doing your work." That's pretty much what you do," she said. She seemed almost puzzled by the question, as if he had asked her why she kept breathing. The meeting with Captain Mercer was brief and practical. He thanked Sarathvo for reaching out through the cooperative channels, confirmed that the Draknari command staff were in custody and being transferred to a cooperative judicial station, and said that the Saratha's promise would be escorted to the nearest repair facility once its emergency systems were stabilized. He spoke plainly and quickly, the way someone speaks when they have a lot of things still to do but want to make sure the conversation is complete before they move on. Sarathvo asked him the same question he had asked Finch. Why had they come so fast? For what had made them move without waiting for committee approval, without formal authorization from the full cooperative council? Mercer looked at him with a mildly confused expression, as if the question itself was the strange part. "Someone asked for help," he said. "That's enough." Sarathvo was quiet for a moment. His membranes shifted through pale yellow, a color that, in Velhari, meant something close to a thing I did not expect to understand, but now do. He said in his own language, and his translator rendered it imperfectly but well enough, "I think I finally understand why the universe was afraid of your world." Mercer looked at him. "We're not trying to scare anyone." "I know," Sarathvo said. "That is exactly what I mean." On the way back to the airlock, walking through the wide corridors of the human ship, with its practical walls and its mountain paintings and its slightly too heavy gravity, Sarathvo thought about his 240 years. He thought about all the times the Velhari had called for help and received forms to fill out, all the times a committee had voted to send a measured response that arrived too late or too small, all the years of careful, diplomatic, cautious inaction dressed up as responsibility. He thought about a captain from Montana who listened to a distress call once, set down his coffee and said, "Plot a course." He thought about a young woman who had been afraid during a battle and stayed at her station anyway, as if the question of what else she would do had simply never occurred to her. And he thought about 17 ships that crossed deep space in hours, not days, because someone needed help, and that was enough of a reason. The Velhari had a word for what he was feeling. It was the same word he had said out loud in the observation room 2 days ago. Alone. To no one in particular. He said it again now, quietly, inside his sealed suit, where no one could hear it. And this time, it felt different. Not like a reminder of how things could go wrong. Like a door that had been opened, and on the other side something he had not expected to find. News traveled fast in the Galactic Cooperative. Not as fast as human ships, as it turned out, but fast enough. Within 2 weeks of the Battle of the Karath Expanse, every species in the Cooperative had heard some version of what happened. By the 3rd week, the story had already begun to change in the retelling, the way stories do when they pass through enough hands. In some versions, the human fleet had been twice as large. In others, the battle had lasted hours instead of minutes. In one version, circulating among the Sulvan traders in the Outer Belt, Captain Mercer had apparently given a lengthy speech before the battle, full of dramatic declarations about justice and courage. His actual words, "I told you I wasn't asking twice," were, if anything, more unsettling to those who heard them accurately. The formal complaint came from the Draknari Empire 3 weeks after the battle. It was a long document, filed through the Cooperative's legal office, accusing the human fleet of unprovoked aggression, excessive use of force, violation of Draknari sovereign military operational space, and several other charges that the filing staff had apparently spent some time constructing. The complaint was detailed and thorough and presented with the confidence of a species that had been filing such complaints for years and having them taken seriously. The Cooperative Council convened a hearing. Earth's representative was Ambassador Carol Avery. She was 61 years old, with silver-streaked hair cut close and the posture of someone who had once stood on the deck of a naval vessel in rough water and found it peaceful. She had spent 20 years in the Earth fleet before moving into diplomatic work, and she had spent another 15 years in diplomatic work before anyone stopped treating the two careers as contradictions. She sat at the hearing table and listened to the entire Draknari presentation without speaking, and her hands folded in front of her, her expression attentive and completely neutral. When it was her turn to respond, she did not stand up. She stayed seated and spoke in the same tone she used for everything, calm, direct, slightly unhurried. "The Draknari fleet outnumbered our vessels," she said. "They had first strike advantage. They were holding 412 civilians hostage and had already disabled the civilian vessels' engines and weapons. Our ships suffered no fatalities during the engagement. Neither did theirs. Every Draknari crew member aboard every disabled vessel was treated according to cooperative medical and detainment standards. She paused. I am genuinely uncertain what proportionate would have looked like to the Council in this situation. I'm willing to have that conversation if the Council believes it's useful. There was a short silence. The Draknari complaint was withdrawn the following morning. The aftermath of Karath spread in other directions, too. The Athari, who handled much of the Cooperative's outer border administration, sent a formal request to Earth asking whether human vessels could be assigned to patrol the 2 transit corridors that ran through the edge of their territory, both of which had experienced Draknari interdictions in the past year. The Solvan Trade Council sent a less formal message that essentially said the same thing in more colorful language. The Karath Din, a nomadic species who traveled in large family fleets and had historically avoided cooperative entanglements, he sent a message to the Cooperative General Channel that simply read, "We would like to know more about the humans." 3 new formal diplomatic requests were pending within a month. Commander Nate Calloway was promoted for his actions at Karath. He accepted the promotion with the same quiet, slightly awkward grace he applied to most things that involved people paying attention to him. He was better at paying attention to other things: tactical patterns, approach angles, the way a formation moved, when it was confident versus when it was not. He had been given a brief commendation ceremony on the ironclad's deck, during which he had stood very still and looked at the floor for most of it. 2 weeks later, an Earth media correspondent caught up with him at a fueling station near the cooperative border, where the ironclad had stopped for resupply. The correspondent asked him a standard list of questions about the battle, most of which he answered with short, precise sentences that were technically complete, but did not give her much to work with. Then she asked what he had been thinking when he first saw the size of the Draknari fleet on the tactical display. Calloway was quiet for a moment. He scratched the back of his neck. "Honestly," he said, "I thought about how we'd explain it to the people on that colony ship if we turned around, and that felt worse than anything the Draknari had." He said it the way he said most things, without drama, without emphasis, in the same tone he used to read out targeting coordinates. The correspondent almost moved on to the next question before she registered what he had actually said. She ran that quote in the opening of her piece. By the end of the week, it had been translated into 41 languages and retransmitted across 14 star systems. It was not the longest thing anyone had said about the battle, or the most poetic. But it had the weight of something true, and true things have a way of moving further than clever ones. Elder Sarath Vo read the quote 3 times when it arrived on his desk. Then he called in his assistant and asked for a measurement of the wall space in the main hall of the new Velhari Human Diplomatic Hall on Velhari Prime, which was still under construction. The building had been approved in record time, another unusual thing, in a cooperative where construction approvals usually took years. He had the quote carved into the wall in letters large enough to read from across the room. In both languages, side by side. Below the quote, in smaller letters, he added a line of his own, something he had written the night after he came back from the ironclad, sitting at his desk in the quiet of the listening station, thinking about mountain paintings and a child in a thermal blanket and a young woman who was afraid and stayed at her station anyway. The line read, "They were afraid. They came anyway." That is the definition of courage in every language worth speaking. On Earth, in a town in Montana, an old woman named Patrice Mercer saw her son's name mentioned in a news article about the Karath expanse. She read the article carefully, then set it down on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the mountains for a while. Then she went and made a fresh pot of coffee, because that was what she did when she needed to think. And she had been doing it that way for 60 years, and it still worked. On the ironclad, Captain Dale Mercer did not read the news coverage. He had a patrol route to finish, a crew report to review, and a section of hull plating near the port side that engineering had flagged as needing inspection after the battle. He had looked at the inspection report twice. It could wait another day. He poured a fresh coffee, settled into the command chair, and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the distress signals were still coming. Different species, different systems, different emergencies. The universe was large and it was old, and the things that could go wrong in it were more numerous than anyone had ever managed to count. But the universe was also, it turned out, full of people who would answer. That was the thing no one had fully accounted for. Not the Draknari, who had assumed that being feared was the same as being safe. Not the Cooperative, which had built its entire system around the slow, careful machinery of collective decision-making. Not even the Velhari, who had spent centuries hoping for help and had never quite let themselves believe it would arrive this fast, this certain, and this completely without conditions. Humanity had been in space for less time than almost anyone else in the Cooperative. They were new. They were strange. They came from a world that had tried to kill them in 100 different ways and had not managed it, which said something about them that was difficult to put into words but very easy to see. What it said was this: they knew what it was to be in danger with no one coming. And they had decided, somewhere back in their long and difficult history, that if they ever had the ability to be the ones who came, they would use it. Not because a committee approved it, not because the math worked out in their favor, not because the species asking was an ally or a trading partner or a strategic interest, because someone asked. And that, it turned out, was the most frightening thing about them. Not their ships, not their armor, not the way they closed range in a fight instead of holding distance, not even the flat, calm voice of a captain who only asked once. It was that they meant it. Every time.